I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land throughout Australia and their connections to country, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The following professional development seminar aims to inform teachers of Indigenous culture, history, disadvantage and effective pedagogy as to meet the requirements of the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers Focus Areas 1.4 and 2.4. A brief overview of Indigenous disadvantage and its impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students' education will also be cited. The bulk of this seminar aims to inform educators of culturally inclusive pedagogical frameworks and teaching strategies in teaching a multicultural Year 9 class, the topic of the stolen generations. Teaching strategies and resources that aid in the teaching of historical atrocities to affected pupils will also be investigated. A 2015 study investigating the prominence of multicultural pre-service training amongst New South Wales educators has also found significant gaps in professional skills relating to teaching a culturally diverse classroom. Out of 5,000 respondents, only 47.5% stated they had completed a form of multicultural pre-service training. Another study conducted in Victoria in 2017 surveyed 1,000 pre-service teachers inquiring how prepared they felt in teaching culturally diverse learners. Results found these pre-service educators felt unprepared to support Indigenous Australian cultural learning needs. An earlier study conducted in 2005 investigates the preparedness amongst pre-service teachers and senior educators to meet the literacy and numeracy education needs of a diverse population of students. This nationwide survey found a need for professional development training in diverse learner education. Less than half of respondents felt prepared to teach Indigenous or English as a second language students. The Australian Professional Standards for Teachers 1.4 and 2.4 states that educators must possess knowledge of Indigenous culture and history, as well as understand how disadvantage impacts the community's education. This is not reflected amongst Australia's teachers and must be corrected so all students receive an inclusive education. A depth study within the Year 9 level history description of the Australian Curriculum 8.4 is Australia and Asia. Within the elective Making a Nation, students will investigate the extension of settlement, including the effects of contact, intended and unintended, between European settlers in Australia and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The first elaboration cites the intended and unintended effects of European colonisation in Australia. The second specifies the topic of the stolen generations. Students will investigate the motivations, experiences and legislature relating to the forcible removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. APST 2.4 states that educators must possess knowledge of Indigenous histories and culture to accurately teach a culturally diverse group of students in this curriculum area. It is essential these standards are met to combat Indigenous disadvantage in education. The gap between non-Indigenous students and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students within education has been acknowledged by the Australian government. It was announced in 2011 that incorporating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures into the curriculum would be a cross-curriculum priority to aid in combating Indigenous disadvantage within education. The 2020 Closing the Gap report assessed differences amongst Indigenous students' school attendance, literacy and numeracy levels, and Year 12 or equivalent attainment compared to that of non-Indigenous students. School attendance amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander primary school students is on average 85%, while secondary students have an average of 72% attendance. Non-Indigenous students have an average of 89% attendance. There has been no improvement in closing this gap in the past 5 years. There is also a gap in numeracy and literacy levels amongst the Indigenous population. Between 17 to 19% of Indigenous students are below the national standards for numeracy. There has been recent significant improvements in Indigenous Year 12 attainment rates. In 2008, there was a gap of 40% between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students' Year 12 completion or equivalent rates. However, there is currently a gap of 25% between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students' Year 12 completion rates. The Indigenous community face multifaceted disadvantages in many areas. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are more likely to have health problems, a criminal background, low socioeconomic status, and a poor education. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's 2018 health report, Australia's Health 2018 in brief, highlights Indigenous disadvantage in health. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are 2.7 times more likely than non-Indigenous Australians to experience mental health problems. Indigenous Australians are 1.7 times more likely to experience a long-term medical condition or disability. This is likely due to the link between poor health and low socioeconomic status. Those experiencing financial hardship are more likely to have substance abuse problems and practice unhealthy habits. Financial barriers prevent patients from being able to access prescription medications, medical services, and dental work. There is a significant overrepresentation of Indigenous Australians in the criminal justice system. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's Pathways to Justice report states that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people account for 27% of persons incarcerated in 2016. Despite this minority group making up only 2% of the nation's population, over a quarter of prisons are comprised of Indigenous Australian offenders. Indigenous overrepresentation within the justice system is a result of severe disadvantage. Low income, substance abuse, and unemployment are some of the main factors that are causing this overrepresentation. The Australian Institute of Criminology highlights the link between employment, educational background, and criminal offending. Indigenous disadvantage within education results in lower employability. Therefore, Indigenous Australians are likely to possess lower socioeconomic status because of a limited education. Education is a major indicator of future life opportunities. In ensuring Indigenous Australians are provided with a culturally inclusive education, this minority group will have increased employability and, as a result, higher socioeconomic status. Providing Indigenous Australians with a culturally inclusive education can combat disadvantage within employment, criminal justice, and health. An inclusive education is schooling that all students can participate and succeed in. Learning environments must be supportive and safe for all students. Every student is entitled to an inclusive education regardless of culture, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and disability. An inclusive education also meets all students' cultural learning needs. Cultural inclusion is the awareness and support of all cultures on a whole school level as well as in the classroom. Fostering community ethos amongst a multicultural population involves celebration of diverse languages, cultures, and values. Racism within the broader community has resulted in schools receiving negative connotations due to large populations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. In response, learning institutions must make encouraging pride in Indigenousness a whole school priority. A lack of cultural safety hinders successful academic performance. Indigenous students experience social exclusion from their community, staff, and peers. Alongside providing a culturally responsive curriculum, classroom, educator, and community, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students must also be provided equitable support to combat disadvantage within education. Many Indigenous students experience financial difficulties and health problems, as well as prejudice. All learning institutions must provide funded equity programs that support students experiencing these problems. Providing an inclusive education that meets the cultural learning needs of Indigenous students will aid in closing the gap in education amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Creating a culturally safe learning environment and providing Indigenous Australians with equity programs will aid in combating Indigenous disadvantage within education. The Australian Professional Standards for Educators Focus Area 2.4 states educators must possess knowledge of Indigenous Australian histories and cultures. This is to ensure educators have an accurate understanding of the stolen generations to efficiently teach that curriculum area. Educators must also have a broader understanding of Indigenous culture as to understand First Nations students. This seminar will present a brief summary of the history of the stolen generations as to meet APST 2.4. It also aims to inform educators of the knowledge required to teach the curriculum area and understand the enormous impact of this historical atrocity has had on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. By possessing accurate knowledge of the stolen generations and Indigenous culture, educators can provide students with learning opportunities to develop their understanding of Indigenous history and culture. First Nations people are advised that the following section of this seminar contains photographs of the deceased. The stolen generations consisted of the forced removal of Indigenous children from their families. The Aborigines Protection Act, Victoria, was enacted in 1869 and legalised the forced removal of children. The Aboriginal Protection Act Board's goal was to assimilate First Nation people into wider society. Indigenous children were taught Christianity within missions where they were only permitted to speak English and prohibited from performing cultural practices. This generation did not have the opportunity to learn about their culture due to this segregation, and many Indigenous languages, practices, and values were not passed on. While this forced removal was intended to be a humanitarian pursuit, eugenic ideologies played a major role in the policy's establishment. Protective legislation was enacted with the aim to diminish the spread of illness, suppress the ongoing violence caused by the frontier wars, and provide a civilised environment for First Nation people. By placing Indigenous Australians into missions, the Aboriginal Protection Act aimed to reduce the spread of disease brought by white settlers that was devastating the Indigenous population. Chief Protector of Aborigines described it as smoothing the pillar of a dying race. The belief that the Indigenous population could not survive within a white society was based on the theory of social Darwinism and eugenic ideology. Many white settlers believed that Indigenous Australians were an inferior race that over time would die out. Neville's text, Australia's Coloured Minority, consists of illustrations and photographs of Indigenous children that are half-blood, quadroon, and octoroon. These children are a product of the assimilation policy in which the Australian government attempted to breed out Indigenous traits. The children raised in these missions suffered oppression, physical and sexual abuse, and forced labour. While the assimilation scheme was a nationwide pursuit, it was extremely underfunded, and children were experienced severe neglect as a result. Most missions did not receive enough food, medicine, or clothing to accommodate large numbers of children. States negated to record or document the children that were removed and placed into missions, and many of the deaths that occurred were not recorded. The Stolen Generations testimonies project record the personal accounts of Indigenous Australian survivors in 2009. These individuals described their personal experiences in which they were removed from their families by law enforcement and placed in either foster homes or missions. Donna Meehan's story describes the moment she was separated from her mother and the stifling isolation she felt growing up in a white ethnocentric community. Meehan was reunited with her mother in her adulthood. However, many victims of the Stolen Generations either could not find their families or was informed they had passed away since their segregation. The Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies describes Indigenous culture as a diverse mix of languages, values, and practices. There are many different communities of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that all have their own laws and customs. First Nation people have cultural connections to their land and community. The community principles describe the holistic cultural perspectives many Aboriginal people share. Bob Randall explains the connections between Dreamtime, place, kinship, and soul. Community is the responsibility to care and nurture the previously stated principles. If any of these responsibilities are not upheld or connections between family and community are weakened, there becomes sickness within that person's soul. It is integral educators understand Aboriginal culture as a holistic concept in which everything is interconnected. To deliver Indigenous students a culturally responsive education, learning must be community-based within a classroom that supports healthy relationships between peers and educators. To provide Indigenous Australian students with inclusive education that meets their cultural learning needs, pedagogical frameworks that support cultural inclusion need to be utilised. APST 1.4 states the requirement that educators understand the impact of cultural background on Indigenous education. Teachers must be able to use teaching strategies that are effective in educating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. The remaining section of his seminar will provide educators with potential pedagogical frameworks and teaching strategies relevant to a multicultural classroom. Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, is a lesson framework used to create inclusive lesson plans. It is specifically relevant in the teaching of culturally sensitive histories as it allows flexible and in-depth planning prior to the lesson. The flexibility of this framework is relevant to lessons incorporating Indigenous cultures and resources because cultural practices will depend on the community your school is situated in. In a multicultural classroom in which cultural diversity plays a significant role on lesson dynamics, it is essential lessons are inclusive to every student. The Stolen Generations are a major part of Australian history, and it is critical that students of all ethnicities understand what the event was and its consequences. This pedagogical framework uses three principles: representation, action, and expression. Educators must represent material in multiple genres, whether this be written, spoken, or visual. giving students multiple choices to express their thoughts and work engages learners and is culturally inclusive. Not all students will respond to one form of engagement, so educators must use multiple methods to obtain learners' attention. This framework incorporates planning for lesson adjustments based on the individual needs of specific students. A relevant adjustment for a classroom containing an Indigenous Australian student would be the exclusion of photographs, videos, or audio recordings of deceased persons. Culturally relevant teaching involves the awareness of the cultural backgrounds of each individual student in a classroom and awareness of your own personal prejudice. Being mindful of potential systemic racism that alienates students in your classroom is critical in promoting social justice amongst students. However, creating positive teacher-student relationships is critical in promoting a culturally safe learning environment. Teaching a topic such as the stolen generations to a Year 9 classroom requires empathy and sensitivity. Students may become upset at mentions of child removal or sexual abuse. Relationships between educators and students must be one of trust and respect to prevent the aggravation of past trauma. To support a healthy teacher-student relationship, educators must set expectations that apply to all learners. Tasks must provide students with manageable challenges that accommodate variations in pace according to individual students' capabilities. Above all else, educators must possess the attitude that all students can and will succeed. A successful teaching strategy effective in Indigenous education is community linking. This involves using Indigenous community resources and utilising local Aboriginal people's input. This strategy nurtures cultural belonging in an education setting. A barrier to this teaching strategy is a lack of access to these resources and the underrepresentation of Indigenous people in education. Schools must utilise staff members with Indigenous backgrounds in teaching curriculum areas relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander topics. This promotes a culturally safe environment and provides valuable community knowledge in the classroom. Another effective teaching strategy is cultural sharing. This involves Indigenous students sharing stories relevant to their cultural background. This approach creates culturally safe environments and gives students the opportunity to express pride in their Indigenous background. Studies have found this student-oriented strategy significantly fosters engagement. Yarning circles are a similar activity to culture sharing in that it is a student-oriented learning method in which learners discuss personal stories and cultural values as a group. Cooperative learning strategy is a learning method in which students work in groups to navigate the learning process. It facilitates the dynamics seen in culture sharing and yarning circles. Studies have shown this strategy is significantly preferred amongst Indigenous students and results in increased participation and academic performance. In applying this learning approach to the UDL framework, educators should represent lesson material audibly and within discussion. Activities should centre around group work in which the educator facilitates shared discussions relating to learning resources. The aforementioned studies highlight culture sharing as a strategy that fosters engagement. Therefore, this activity should be used in tasks to encourage student participation. Here we have provided links to a few of the resources used in this seminar that may be useful in your classroom. Neville's text, The Coloured Minority, is a primary source that can be analysed in classrooms that do not have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in attendance. It is important to be aware of that some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students cannot view photographs of the deceased. The What Works program workbook and guidebook, Improving Outcomes for Indigenous Students, is a valuable resource for educators teaching the topic of the stolen generations. It provides teaching strategies for classrooms containing Indigenous Australian students and resources to aid in closing the gap within education. This seminar discusses the lack of pre-service training relating to multicultural education in Australian schools. APST 1.4 and 2.4 state the requirements that all educators have broad knowledge of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and histories while understanding how Indigenous disadvantage impacts their education. Educators must be aware of Indigenous histories, cultures, and disadvantage to successfully provide students with an inclusive education. Pedagogical frameworks such as UDL promote cultural inclusion and facilitates the integration of relevant teaching strategies. The resources provided will aid educators in culturally relevant lesson planning. A country's history fundamentally shapes its national identity. As a history teacher, you hold the responsibility of moulding the next generation's perception of Australia. It is essential significant historical events such as the stolen generations are accurately taught to prevent First Nations people from being omitted from their national identity. To achieve this, Indigenous learners must be provided with an inclusive education that meets their cultural learning needs. Combating Indigenous disadvantage within education will also aid in closing the gap in health, justice and poverty. By providing Indigenous Australian students with inclusive and equity-based education that aids in closing the gap, we can protect our most vulnerable children from systemic disadvantage. Thank you for attending this seminar.